Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Parliament officially resumes today, but you'd be forgiven for thinking it started a couple of weeks ago when Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced a backflip on the Stage 3 tax cuts. It's the dominant issue as the Pollies return to Canberra, with Opposition Leader Peter Dutton saying he won't stand in the way of lower taxes. Tough one for the opposition. They could easily attack the government over a broken election promise, except the change in policy will see about 8 and 9 taxpayers better off. Charles Croucher is the Chief Political Editor for Nine News. Charles, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Sean, great to be here.
So, big year coming up. How has Anthony Albanese handled these first few weeks with the changes or the proposed changes to the Stage 3 tax cuts?
Look, it's been a big surprise to start, right? This happened before Australia Day, which is usually, or has in the past, been almost the ceasefire that gets you through Christmas and to Australia Day as the country focuses on tennis and cricket and avoiding natural disasters over the past few years. This is the big change. And what the Prime Minister has done, as you mentioned, has picked out the vast majority to be better off. And he's also taken back some initiative that the government really lost in the latter half of 2023. That came through the failure of the Voice referendum and then also some of the decisions from the High Court that set in spark a debate about immigration and sort of law and order, typically strong topics for the opposition and particularly in the wheelhouse of Peter Dutton. So this is going back to basics. They'll say going back to Labor values, certainly putting a Labor lens on what was a coalition policy and taking back the initiative when it comes to the political debate. And I think they've done that pretty well. You know, John Howard set the gold standard when it comes to performing a U-turn or changing your mind. He went to an election with the GST. This isn't quite that, but the Prime Minister has fronted up on this. He has wedged the opposition to the point where I think you're right. Standing in the way of people getting tax cuts is a very bold, brave, probably foolish place to be. And certainly that's not something you suspect from Peter Dutton. And instead, it will be the question of whether they actually back the changes or just don't oppose them, which are different things and come with it sort of different risks.
Okay, so what do you think Dutton will do? Because you just explained why it is tricky for them. He doesn't want to be the person not giving tax cuts to all these people. And does it sort of take the wind out of his sails at this point, or can he regather that momentum from last year?
We can regather, but it is a different argument altogether, and what the argument will become about on the opposition's behalf. And I think they've done a moderate job of this so far is make it about the U-turn, make it about the lie.
Yep.
And if that's the case, how do you trust the Prime Minister moving forward? It's me quoting some opposition lines there. I guess the problem becomes that if you don't vote for the changes, then that's a government attack line that they didn't vote for you to get a tax cut. And so you can still prosecute the process without actually prosecuting the policy itself. I think, in terms of the policy, what it does for the government and what it does for a lot of Australians, and certainly you speak to backbenchers around here, they'll start saying this, is it maps out the potential for 6 to 8 good months for economic news for those Australians that are hurting the most. Now, there are so many Australians, every focus group that we do, that political parties do, that anyone does, puts cost of living number one. So what the government will argue is that with real incomes now on the way up, I think that will be confirmed when we get the wage data that comes out reasonably soon. What you will see now is that things are going to get easier from here on. There is a indexation of pension and some of the welfare rates in March. We then have the budget in May. There'll be more cost of living measures there. Then you get potentially the first rate cut, be it June, July, August, around that period. Then you get tax cuts in July. You also get a decision on the minimum wage in June that comes in July. So Australians are going to start having more money in their pay packets each week or fortnight or month. And that, according to some of the Labor MPs around here, will lift spirits in the community. So that's the message and the path that they're trying to walk. For the opposition, it is hard to stand in the way of that when it has been such a dominant feature and is the dominant feature. I guess the other option is, does the opposition go further? Do they say, and politically you could do this, they say we're going to keep the lower end tax cuts and raise that top tax bracket to 200,000, or do we eliminate the 37 from a higher mark? Or they could bring it on earlier, or there are a couple of options that run around that could see more money in people's pockets. Of course, that all means less money in the budget. And while our budget situation is pretty good year on year, in the long run, it's still in a really bad spot. So that's the difficulty now. And again, it's a fight being fought on Labor's terms now. It was on the opposition's at the end of last year.
Okay, so beyond taxes, what are we going to hear a lot about this year? I presume IR legislation part 2. We'll hear a lot about that. What else?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. In particular, that right to switch off is something that the Greens are really heavily for. Some of the crossbenchers have been trying for as well. And it's so fundamental to the way so many Australians work is this: if you clock off, does that mean you're off the clock effectively, and that you won't answer emails or answer calls? Or at what stage does being on call become being paid on call? These are pivotal things to the way Australians work, and because of our phones, it's something that has changed and warped. So how technology will keep, or legislation will keep up with technology, is going to be a big one. Look, we're still waiting for trade normalisation with China. That is huge for Australia in terms of the budget bottom line. And then we have this issue. Cost of living will remain huge. Housing is still the number one contributor to cost of living, the number one issue in Australia, so that becomes big. But we then have these series of elections around the world that are going to have a major impact on the way Australia runs, and it's kind of out of our hands. There's an election in Indonesia in the next 2 weeks. There is an election in India this year. There's an election in the European Union. There's likely an election in the UK. And then, of course, there's the big one in November in the United States that would change everything again. So, look, this is going to be a lot of domestic fixes on Australia's government's front. Cost of living, housing, real bread and butter issues that are so important to every Australian, but then sort of always, fizzling away or always there in the peripheral with these international elections at a time when, liberal democracies are a minority sport and things are getting harder for democracies, not easier. And it's going to be an awfully big test of all of that this year.
Stay with me, Charles. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Charles Croucher, Chief Political Editor for Nine News. What about polls more local? So Cook is the obvious one, with Scott Morrison's old seat in the southern suburbs of Sydney. I would imagine that the coalition would be very confident of retaining that, but still it'll just be interesting to see I'm not even sure when it is. It must be in coming months. I'm not sure. It'd be interesting to see what the voters are saying.
They haven't announced a date yet because Scott Morrison hasn't formally resigned yet. He's made his intentions clear. So that will happen, I suspect, March, April. That will be a big test. Obviously, Dunkley in Melbourne as well. Peter Murphy, her old seat, that's a really important one to Labor backbenchers, not just because they almost to a person loved Peter, but because it is on a margin that would, if the Liberal Party were to win that, would really worry a lot of Labor MPs. But on the same note, if they're looking at results of holding the line in Dunkley, perhaps limiting it to 1 or 2% swing against them, if they do better than expected in Cook, then there will be some, and this is a minority at the moment, but there will be some that will go through that path I laid out before and think that if things are looking pretty good around October, November, December, and there is a chance they can extend their majority in the House of Reps, then there may be the temptation to call an election at the end of the year. This Queensland election makes it difficult. Obviously, the US will take up a lot of the oxygen, but heading into summer was always a really popular time for an election with John Howard. And there are lots of people inside the current government that look at the way the politics more than the policy of John Howard and think they did it pretty well. So, it's still a minority. It will still be largely dependent on the way that things are looking at that time. But we're due an election by, I think, May next year. So, what's 5 or 6 months between friends if you can avoid that summer where people switch off and a summer where people could lose jobs or a summer where things could go wrong. If they've got the opportunity, then I suspect there'll be some that'll want them to take it as well. So we may get more than just polls that we see in the newspapers. We may get the real one.
Now, Charles, I can't let you go without asking about the US election, because I know you've covered US elections previously. Pretty phenomenal kind of just to watch US politics play out on both sides of politics as well, because we talk a lot about Trump, but, an 81-year-old Biden coming up for re-election, it's going to be a great year, isn't it? It's going to be fun watching.
It's going to be remarkable. And, it's hard to search for a precedent in anything involving Donald Trump. We know what he's trying to do now. He's only been done once before by Grover Cleveland. That was well over a century ago. We know what he's trying to do in terms of the legal side of things is also going to be unprecedented. He's going to spend as much time in courtrooms almost as on the campaign. And he is turning the courtroom into his campaign trail.
Good media.
Yeah, he absolutely is. Everyone's going to watch. The question I wonder as I watch the primaries play out is who is the voter that perhaps voted for Barack Obama in 2012, swung to Donald Trump in 2016, then said, nope, I've had enough in 2020 and went back to Joe Biden? Who is the voter that then 4 years later goes, actually, you know what, I'm back to Trump again?
Yeah.
That swing voter in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, I just don't know if there is those old members of what was Hillary's blue wall that Donald Trump crushed in that suburban area. Who is that voter that then swings back to the Republicans this time around? The former president, President Trump's position has been so dominant in the Republican Party. I wonder at what expense to independents, particularly suburban women, that were so vital 4 years ago. And of course, in the subsequent 4 years, we've had the High Court intervene with the Dobbs decision on abortion, which has really been the dominant feature of every subsequent election. So I think we're going to see a lot of money spent, a lot of focus on the race that's coming. Anyone who gives you a prediction now is probably kidding themselves because things change so rapidly in the United States day to day, let alone 8 months out. But it will be those same Rust Belt states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, throw in Arizona, maybe Nevada, maybe Georgia. It's still the same six. It's still the same fight, and it's going to be great to watch.
Yeah.
But I think Democrats will look almost at the same path we spoke about with the Labor government here. They're about 8 months ahead of us when it comes to inflation is down, wages are up, unemployment is still good. We assume the Fed will start cutting rates soon. They will hope that good economic news we've seen for 2 or 3 months will start filtering through and people will feel it. There's no good in everyone talking about it if you're not feeling it. The Democrats will hope that people will start feeling it, and that'll be enough to keep them on President Biden's side. Despite the obvious challenges for the Biden campaign, Mike Murphy, who ran George W. Bush's campaign, was involved with John McCain, Arnold Schwarzenegger's campaign in California. He described it perfectly. He said, Joe Biden's age at the moment is like him having antlers, in that no matter what happens, how good the policy is, how successful the speech or the legislation is, he's still the guy with antlers, and you can't kind of get past that. So the challenge is, will enough voters who are questioning the guy with antlers be able to come in, maybe hold their nose and close their eyes and vote for the Democrat again? We wait and see.
It's going to be a fun year locally and internationally. Charles, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Anytime.
That's Charles Croucher, Chief Political Editor for 9 News. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.